and I hope that we can entertain you. I've learned quite a lot this morning already. One thing I didn't know, Pete, was you've been in computing 2 years longer than me. And we've been approaching computing from another angle, and that particularly is what my part of today is about. Because, as you all know, here we are in the British Computer Society, and you've heard about this curious organisation called the Real-Time Club, which is a bunch of entrepreneurs. I'm told the word bunch is not fashionable at the moment, but we think we're a bunch of entrepreneurs. And we're interested in setting up companies and making things happen and all that sort of thing. We've been around since, we're really quite a young organisation. We've been around since 1967. And we're interested in the implications of computing and the extrapolation of what computing is capable of. And those are the two subjects I'd like to talk about later this afternoon, or this evening. And I suppose the best way to introduce it is like most other teenagers. I was trying to find better ways of learning poetry for homework and wondering how my brain could remember things better, which, needless to say, got me into quite a lot of trouble at school. And perhaps that's where the interest came from. I was lucky enough to get into computing more or less when it started. I've known Peter for a very long time, and many of you will know Brian Oakley, who was the chief executive of the research councils for must have been 20 years. And he and Peter and I were having dinner at the Real-Time Club one evening, and we were talking about quantum physics and the potential for a quantum computer. And Brian was saying that the European Commission, the research part of the European Commission, were wondering whether they should get involved. So the three of us went over to Brussels and said, why don't we set up, and it became known as the Quantum Computing in Europe Pathfinder Project, 1998, right
yes,
about there, something like that. And so the three of us used to go to Brussels and to the various meetings all around Europe, and had some very interesting discussions, which is more or less the genesis of a lot of the things we're talking about today. We've thought for a long time in computing that they're fun boxes, and people thought to start with they were boxes to do with mathematics for mathematicians to play with. Well, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a scientist actually, and we've seen computing from a quite different angle, because it can do so much more. But the world still seems to think that computers are something to do with mathematics, or all to do with mathematics. And as you well know, the computing industry all takes the view that they know the answers to everything, which we do. We're not arrogant about this, just truthful. And we've therefore annoyed every industry that we've got involved in. The banks hate us. Well, everybody does. And we're used to it. We're used to forecasting what might happen. We're used to being told we're idiots, and we thoroughly enjoy it when we're right. Whether that's true this time round remains to be seen. But it seemed to us that there were so many similarities, not between what's in a box for a computer and what's in one's skull, but the system. And we think computers help enormously in framing the questions we need to ask about how, if you like, the brain works. And the cognitive neuroscientists, almost without exception, have told us please to go away and not trouble them. Equally, with the growth of biogenetics, is roughly speaking, if you think about it, Crick and Watson coming up with DNA roughly at the same time that we were beginning to create computers. And it seemed to us that DNA bore strong resemblance to the memory we have. Very interestingly, only about 2 years ago, suddenly, everyone's beginning to say, gosh, yes, perhaps there are some connections, perhaps we can learn from each other. And we've used this word, convergence. And we're absolutely delighted that lots of people have been saying, well, there are similarities. Surely we can work together. Surely we can find ways of looking at each other. And indeed, by looking at the way the brain works, maybe we can learn a bit about DNA and all, the way all that works. We can learn a lot in computing and how to design our computing systems. And therefore, we'd be particularly delighted to see this feedback. And in particular, Dan Dennett, which I'm sure is a name that you all know very well, who strictly speaking isn't in computing. I guess he would say he's a philosopher of computing. Wrote a book which I must admit, I thought I read all his books till I saw his CV and then realized I've got another 36 to read. About how we can think. And in that, I found this chapter about how a Turing engine that can just add and subtract can be programmed to beat a chess master. And it's the best programming manual I've certainly ever seen. And I think it's great that that's coming from a philosopher and not from the pseudo-drags of the computing industry. So he came over and gave a presentation at the Royal Institution to the real-time club. We invited the British Computer Society, but they were too busy. So we reprinted that chapter, and there's some copies outside. Also, IT Now printed an article that was written by about 6 of us, but only the other 5 weren't too happy having their name on it, so it's just got mine. And there are some copies out there if you'd like one, and we've reprinted them. Flowing from that, with the help of Max, well, I'm introducing them, we're writing a series of 4 articles. The first one is being printed for this current edition of IT Now. Taking the subject a little bit further, and the real reason I thought this would be very helpful for us to start talking about this. Because that article about convergence of these 3 areas has produced a lot of reaction, even in the last 12 months. And in more and more cases, we're beginning to realize that it may well be that computing, biogenetics, cognitive neuroscience, and even synthetic biology, which that's what we're talking about, seem to be getting closer and closer, and we're beginning to wonder whether it's actually one subject with different facets. Now, why would this be of interest to undergraduates? It sounds as though it's a bit sort of way out. Well, I'd like to put the case to you for your consideration later today. Interesting thought. If you look back at all the inventions that human beings have made pretty well since the beginning of time, if you want to start with the plough and the wheel and all the rest of it. And all the inventions of the Industrial Revolution, we as human beings, we use them as tools from the first time someone picked up a stick all the way to the most complicated electro engines and things like that. They've supplemented our muscles. Now, think about it. That's had no effect whatsoever on the evolution of human beings. We may have used all these gadgets. Peter flew in from Nice this morning, and we can fly, we can go in cars and all the rest of it. But it hasn't in the slightest bit changed human muscles. Computing, potentially different. Computing actually supplements our brains. And we're beginning to realize that maybe with our computers, we can help us actually have better brains. If that is true, okay, it's a big if, that is a breakthrough of enormous proportions. It means that the Industrial Revolution was just a foretaste of what is possible. A very, very exciting thought, and frankly, people have only been thinking this relatively recently. But once we begin to look at it, it does produce some quite exciting changes. And so, I said that one began by trying to think how better to learn. My feeling is that I guess all students have the same view, whether you're 22 or Peter's and my age. How do we learn? How do we learn? What is information? How do we learn that information? One said that we can answer questions in exams, which is a relatively trivial detail. How can we use it to understand more? How can we make better decisions? How can we improve our brains? And if we could do that, we really will have made a paradigm shift. So, we'd like to put that case to you this afternoon. Max is working on a PhD at Oxford at the moment in synthetic biology, which is yet another piece of jigsaw. Because there are all sorts of, in a sense, computers floating around inside of our bodies, rather large numbers of people talking about that. And then one starts saying, can we put these together? I mean, we're all used to having these little gadgets in our pockets, which is rather fun. We can talk to them and that sort of thing. But the interface is through language. Could we, in the next, over this coming generation of us students now, envisage a prosthetic brain? And we'll be talking about this afternoon. So I hope we can entertain you.